This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello, my name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Blake Fichera, who is the author of 2 books of interviews that he's made with composers of film music for horror movies, entitled Scored to Death and Scored to Death 2. If you enjoy the podcast, please remember to like, subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY, but before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
You know, my road to the Scored to Death books is in a lot of ways a long one, in that when I was in my teens in the mid-90s, I discovered the music of John Carpenter. And my first soundtrack that I bought myself, probably, at least in the horror field, was In the Mouth of Madness. I saw that film with my friends at my birthday sleepover, and we used to make a lot of movies together on VHS with my mom's VHS camcorder. And at the time, it was the mid '90s, and so it was a lot of Quentin Tarantino ripoff type stuff, you know. And and so we were very much doing that kind of thing. But it was a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds and whatnot. We watched In the Mouth of Madness. And that opening track, which was originally temped with when he was editing Enter Sandman by Metallica. So it's this hard rocking thing that he redid for that. And it just captured both mine and my friends' imaginations. And that night at like 4 a.m, we made our first horror movie with the end credits of that playing in the background as the background music, because that's how we did it back then. We didn't have editing systems. We just kind of filmed and did that. Flash forward a few years, I went to film school at a school called SUNY Purchase, which at the time was probably one of the best undergraduate programs. It was just outside of New York City. And we shot on film and edited on flatbeds, and from day one, kind of. It wasn't even like we had to wait till we were seniors or something. But the benefit of going to a film school, for me anyway, was one, location, being just outside of New York City, and two, being surrounded by people around my age that were also really passionate about film. My friends were, to a certain extent, but they weren't enough to try to pursue it the way I did. And it was a tight-knit group. Every year, I think they accepted like 30 students into the program, maybe, and then less actually showed up. So 20 some students. And for me, the big benefit was becoming friends with these people, because then you start to share the things you've seen, the things you're interested in, and then as well as going to class and seeing film history, you just, at that age, you're just a sponge. And so people had seen some of the Italian horror stuff, and I just submerged myself in horror also at that time, because one, I consider a perfect storm of things. I was in school with people, and some of them were into horror movies, and they introduced me to horror movies that I hadn't seen before. Joe Bob Briggs's Monster Vision was on TV, and I didn't have cable at home, but I did at school. So I started watching that. Living just outside of New York City, I had access to the kinds of video stores that I didn't have access to in the suburbs. Everything came together. Anchor Bay was releasing Lucio Fulci movies, George Romero movies, remastered. It was just kind of a wonderful time to be a horror fan. The internet was still kind of new to me. We're talking like 97. So I didn't have the internet at home. I'd have to go to the college library. And when I kind of discovered the films of Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci, I also discovered the music of Goblin and Fabio Frizzi. And for me, there was no turning back from there, with John Carpenter, Goblin, Fabio Frizzi. I was always kind of into film music. I loved John Williams growing up, like so many kids my age. My dad listened to film music. So it never seemed weird to me to like film music. But these guys was a different breed of film music. It was a kind of film music that was more equated to pop and rock and the kinds of things that I would listen to on my own. So I just kind of fell in love with it then. So we're talking late 90s, stayed obsessed with Goblin. In 2000, they reunited for Dario Argento for a film called Non Ho Sono. They put out an album. Simonetti put out an album with a band called Diamonia, which he created, which he reworked a lot of the Goblin and some of the Keith Emerson stuff and Morricone stuff that they did for Dario Argento into more of a hard rock, heavy metal thing. And I just loved that album. I would commute. I didn't have a car, and I would commute 2.5 hours every day for work. I was editing educational films, and I didn't have an MP3 player then. Now we're talking about 2001. So I dug out a Walkman, and I bought a blank cassette. And on side A, I had Hall & Oates' Rock and Soul Greatest Hits Volume 1. And on side 2, I had Daimonia's Dario Argento Tribute. And I listened to it every single day. It was like Hall & Oates in the morning, Daimonia on the way home. It was like it covered all my bases. Whatever mood I was in, I was satisfied. So then I just stayed a huge fan. Around 2013, and this is what I talk about in the preface of my book, Goblin, a version of Goblin that was really technically called New Goblin, but when they came to America, they were just called Goblin, and it was half Goblin members, original Goblin members, and half Daimonia members, which was Simonetti's band from the early 2000s. And they came to America, and I saw them in Brooklyn, and it was kind of a dream come true, something I never thought would happen. And it ignited the most intense addiction to that music that to date, to up to that point. And I was just obsessed with learning more about the band. And when I discovered that there wasn't a whole lot of information, at least here in the States, I discovered that there was a book in Italian. Somebody had written a great book in Italian called 7 Notes in Red, or whatever the Italian translation is that. And since then, it's been translated into English. But at the time, there wasn't anything. So I was like, I need to find out more. So I decided that I was going to reach out to Claudio, who I had reached out to as a fan a bunch of times in the decades before that. But and I wanted to interview him. So then it was like, okay, so what am I going to do with this interview? And just kind of slowly in late 2013, we're talking October is when I saw the band, was for Halloween. So November, December, I start thinking, okay, I want to reach out to him. I want to interview him. What can I do with it? You know, I love John Carpenter. Maybe I could interview John Carpenter. Maybe I could interview somebody else from the band. Maybe I could interview Fabio Frizzi. And suddenly this idea started to formulate of like, maybe I could put together a collection of interviews. So I started to read books of interviews with composers, because I said to myself, I'm a musician, but my knowledge of film theory is limited. Let me see what other people are doing. So I started reading other books of interviews, and for the most part, I got discouraged because a lot of them were kind of very heavy in music theory. And I said, well, I can't do that. Like, I don't speak that language. So maybe I'm not the guy to do this. I conversed with my buddy, Dave, who I lived with in college and who we geeked out over that music together. And I said to myself, if anybody would read a book about this, it would be Dave. So let me ask him what he thinks. And so we talked about it, and I came to the conclusion, like, hey, I'll do 2 or 3 interviews to see how it goes. And if I don't feel they're good enough for a book, if I'm not the right person to do this, I'm sure I could persuade a horror movie website to let me post a truncated version of those interviews so that they'll live in some way on a website. Thinking that most people would say no. You know, I put together a dream list of composers I'd like to talk to. Thinking that most people would say no, I asked 5 or 6, 7 composers, and they all said yes. And so suddenly it was like, okay, it was going to be the idea of doing a couple of test interviews went out the door, because now I had 5 or 6 people. So I said, okay, I guess I'm going to try to write a book. And the first interview took place in January of 2014, which was Harry Manfredini. The very next day, I interviewed Alan Howarth. And then a couple of days later, after I read the interview, I listened to the interview and transcribed the interview with Alan Howarth. I interviewed Alan Howarth some more because I was still finding my legs of what it was going to be. I just remember Harry Manfredini, who was the first one, and he's the composer who's best known for the Friday the 13th films. I emailed him, and I found his contact information online. I emailed him, and I said, I'd like to interview. I'm starting a book. He said, how long do you think it's going to be? And I said, I don't know, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And he's like, oh, I'm going to talk a lot longer than that. And so Harry and I talked for 2 hours, maybe more. And that interview, I'm actually very thankful that his interview was the first one, because that interview is the one that set the pace for the rest of the interview. Had I done an interview that was an hour long, 45 minutes long first, I might have said to myself, this is the pace. This is what these interviews are going to be. But Harry and I talked for so long, and it was so interesting. And he's such a fascinating guy. And we talked in depth about so much stuff. It was like, okay, I guess like this is the bar for the rest of them. And so then I was off to the races. And over the next, 2 years or so after that, I was working on the book that eventually became Score to Death: Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. After that, I wanted to jump. I was so into it. I wanted to jump into the next one. And my publisher was like, whoa, slow your roll. Like, let's see if anybody wants this.
Cool your jets.
Yeah. But I really wanted to keep going. And then I waited a year. They said, let's wait a year. So I waited a year, and then they said, well, we think we're going to not do a second one. So then I said, well, my work in this field not done. What else can I do? I had been doing a podcast with a good friend of mine for a couple of years, starting in 2004. Just kind of soon after I started the book, I started doing a podcast with a buddy of mine. I had guested on a podcast he was doing with some friends of his, and we enjoyed talking about movies. He and I went to film school together, so I had known him for 20 years, almost 20 years at that point. We were freshman roommates. So he's like a brother. He's one of my best friends. And so I said, well, I'm doing this stuff in podcasting. I had done a lot of guest podcasting in promotion of the book the first book when it came out. So then I started doing Score to Death, the podcast, which was kind of a continuation. I was interviewing more composers, but it was an audio version. After doing that for a year, some things occurred that I don't think are really worth going into, but needless to say, the publisher came back around and said, hey, do you want to do, I told them I'm going to do a second one, and I might be doing it with another publisher if you guys are okay with that. And they said, well, maybe we could do it here. And so I ended up doing it with the same publisher who I loved working with on the first one. I thought they did a really great job with the book. And so the second book ended up becoming half the interviews are interviews that started in the podcast, most of which have updated information. So I did, I interviewed them, and then I interviewed them again more in depth, or updates of what they were doing after we first talked for the second book. And then the second half of the interviews was just all new stuff specific to the second book. So that's how Scored to Death 2 happened.
Excellent. But I mean, one of the things that I really appreciated reading the book was the fact that you're putting all of these different people together. And although they're interrelated, Alan Howarth writes music with John Carpenter and works on his films. Some of them are very, very different and are very far apart. But because you put them all together, you sort of see links, and you see sort of different methodologies, different approaches, different attitudes, and it's just really interesting to have those interviews all in one place.
Yeah, when I started, it didn't really, wasn't my plan that I was going to ask them all the same questions. And I don't. There's a good portion of them where I ask them all the same question. And a lot of them I don't, because a lot of the questions are specific to the movies they worked on, the filmmakers they worked on, etc. The book, more than anything, it's kind of under the guise of a horror movie book, but it's really mostly about the process of creating. It's like celebrating those composers. You learn about them personally, and then it's kind of learning about the process of creating music for film and how they all approach it. And the majority of the movies that we talk about just happen to be horror films. And then some of the questions towards the end of those interviews kind of lean more into what makes horror music different than other types of film music and things like that. But it wasn't my intention that I was going to ask them all the same questions, but I was getting such good answers to so many of those questions. And then and then I would maybe tweak those questions as I went on, and I saw what people were saying. It really was this wonderful evolution, the interview style that went into the book. Had an evolution as I saw what was working and what wasn't working, and the questions that weren't getting the kinds of answers I thought were worthwhile enough to put into a book where there was restrictions of time and space. So I started editing as I went along. Yeah, absolutely. The things that I find fascinating about a lot of the questions when I ask them a lot of the same questions are not just the differences, but the similarities. I found in the first book, very much there were two schools of composer. There were composers who were more classically trained. They maybe went to school for it. A lot of them taught it. They learned how to compose. They learned how to conduct an orchestra. And those guys had a very different way of writing from people that were more rock oriented. But the people that composed with classical training composed in a more similar way. And the people that composed who came from a rock and synth background was more of an improvisational style. So those questions became about that. And then when I went into the second book, or even into the podcast, and I started talking to people, and I started gearing questions toward that, I found that the second book has a lot younger, the proportion of more current, younger composers is greater in the second book, because when I did the second book, I was trying to figure out, well, what can I do that this first book doesn't offer? The first book was very heavily weighted in 70s and 80s composers with some guys from the 90s and 2000s. So the second book became more weighted in people that were younger or working today, their heydays today, with some guys who are older. There's just like a kind of a balancing act of how can this book be different? But because I was interviewing so much younger guys, I found that there was a lot, the line wasn't as clear with how they composed. There was a lot, I do a little bit of both. It was a lot of, I do a little bit of both. So suddenly everything that I thought I kind of knew from doing the first book, a lot of that wasn't relevant for the second book. So it was just a really interesting process, not just, you're saying having all these guys in a collection, but diving so heavily into this style of this brand of art and music in 5 or 6 years time, interviewing. The books combined 30 composers, but then the podcast also has a bunch. So we're talking about upwards of 40 composers that I interviewed over, I don't know, from 2014 to, 2018, 19, something like that. So it was pretty heavy. And so it was a lot of information. And it was a wonderful process. And yeah, there was a lot of interesting things about, if you put up the bullet, the cork board, the bulletin board, you start to pull out the yarn, like a police investigation.
Serial killer is here somewhere.
Of process and style and collaborations and equipment, especially. What I found in the second book was I became friends with somebody who I work with. My day job is as an editor and producer for television. And I became friends with a story producer that I was working with on a project. And he came from Pittsburgh, and he was a huge Romero fan, and he was a big horror guy. And he's also a musician, so he was way into the music. So he bought a copy of my book when I told him about it. And he's the one, his name's Mark. He's the one that said, I'd love to know more about the synths they were using. And I said, oh, okay. So when I started doing the podcast and the second book, people will notice that I ask more questions about the specific equipment, like what synths we're using, what samplers, what drum machines, because I found through the process after the first book, promoting it, going to horror conventions with the book to sell it, talking to horror film music fans for the first time, really, because I did the first book in a bit of a vacuum, being on Twitter, conversing with the film music fans, I started to learn, like, okay, this is the kind of information they're looking for. The first book was information I was trying to find out. And now I'm going to dedicate some of the second book to the information that these people are saying they want. So the second book we do talk about equipment in the first book, but the second book, it gets a little more specific about it.
It's so interesting as well. I mean, I have a similar experience doing this podcast, in that I feel like I've done a crash course in film books because I've been reading so many film books and talking to people. Do you feel like you've learned a heck of a lot?
Oh yeah, I certainly more than I ever would have imagined I would learn. If you talk to teenage me, whether it was after I saw John Carpenter, after I got into John Carpenter music, or after I got into Goblin, and you said, hey, in 20 years, you're going to interview all these guys, and people are going to think of you as an expert in this kind of music. And I would have thought I was crazy. And when people kind of when people, mention that they think of me that way, they ask me to come on to talk about something because they think I'm an expert in something, I always just say, well, just read the books and you too can be an expert.
It's all there. I'm learning with you. I'm learning.
No. Yeah, like everything I know about it is stuff that those guys told me. I didn't leave anything out. I mean, there's some, obviously the books are edited, but for the most part, you can know everything I know about it too, just by reading what they told me.
Absolutely. I mean, and you're meeting some of your heroes. So you're having conversations with some of your heroes. And I was really interested in a John Carpenter interview because I've never interviewed John myself, but I do have friends who've interviewed him and who have said he's kind of a short answered guy, and he sort of has this. And I thought your interview was really good because you kind of didn't let him just give short answers. You kind of pushed him a little bit on some stuff and got some really interesting material.
Yeah, I mean, that was by far the most intimidating interview. I mean, he was, that still is, probably even more so now, my favorite director of all time. How I met Dave, who I mentioned earlier, who I ran the idea of doing the book by, who I lived with in college. How I met, he was in the film program, but he was a year ahead of me. So when I was a freshman, he was a sophomore. When I was a sophomore, he was a junior. But when you're in film school and you start talking to people, other film students, and one of the natural things is, oh, so what kind of stuff are you into? Who's your favorite directors? And I would say John Carpenter. And everybody would say, oh, you got to meet Dave. Because Dave was, John Carpenter was Dave's favorite filmmaker. And I was on the set for a student film, and somebody came over to me and said, that guy Dave? He's standing right there. So I walked over to Dave. I said, I hear you like John Carpenter. And he laughed. And then, months later, we lived together. It was kismet. So John Carpenter had been such a huge part of my life. He was the reason why, among Goblin and Fabio Frizzi, but I mean, one of the real inspirations for the book, for me wanting to do the book. So I was so intimidated. I had the great benefit of interviewing him. I did 2 interviews with him for the book, and they're not separate; they're edited together within the one chapter. But the first time I interviewed him, I asked him, would you ever think about doing an album that was just an album, not a soundtrack? just an album of music. And that question got edited out of the book because 6 months later, he announces that he has an album coming out. So, and then when that album Lost Themes came out,
you planted
Dave's convinced of that, but I'm skeptical about the origins of that. But when Lost Themes came out, then Lost Themes 2 came out, he did a ton of press for it. He was on every blog, every website talking about music, so much so that by the time I was able to interview him again, because I said to his assistant, he told me he wasn't doing it. The book's not out yet. I would love to talk to him about it so that I could be as up to date as I can be. By the time I talked to him, the second interview and the first interview were night and day. I had the huge benefit of talking to him in depth about his music before anybody had ever talked to him at that length about his music before. His music in interview, the way he talked about his music in interviews before that was always a couple of questions about the Halloween theme. It was always a second part, the second thought to the rest of the interview. But I interviewed him specifically about his music for an hour the first time, maybe a little bit more, 70 minutes, 80 minutes, something like that. And I just felt like he had a good time, which is something I totally didn't expect. We laughed up together. I used the word diegetic, and he's like, I had never heard that word before, which I doubt very much. But but he was laughing at me for using the word diegetic and not diegetic. There's a funny part that's obviously not in the interview, but something happened. He's like, oh, can you hold on a second? Hold on 1 second. And he puts me on hold, and his phone had this very creepy, 8-bit early 1990s music on it that was within the phone, which I had never heard a phone do that before. But he came back. He's like, okay, sorry. And I said, John, I have to tell you, that's the creepiest hold music I've ever heard. And he started laughing. He's like, yeah, I don't know how to turn that off. And I isolated that. I cut that out, and I sent just that bit to a couple of friends of mine because I thought they would find the music funny. But everybody's response was he sounded like he really wanted to get back to you. They all focused on the fact of when he put me on hold, how he, wanted to really get back to the conversation. I never really thought of it that way. So I just got very lucky that he was very into it, because I don't feel like he had ever talked that much about music before. And of course, when the interview was done, I was disappointed because his interview just doesn't feel like the other ones. The way he thinks about music, or at least then, because he wasn't a rock star then, now he's a rock star. Quite literally, the way he thought about music was an afterthought. He directed the movie, then after he had a cut of the movie, then he sat down and he did the music. Whereas a guy like Harry Manfredini, Chris Young, any of these other guys in the book, that's their primary focus. If I was to have asked John Carpenter when I did the first interview, what do you do for a living? He wouldn't have said I compose music for horror movies or movies. I'm not a film composer. He would have said I make movies, or I'm a retired filmmaker, or whatever. So he just doesn't think about music the way the other guys do. And he's not educated in it the way the other guys are. So I don't think he has the vocabulary to talk about it the way the other guys do. So when the interview was done, I was disappointed because I just felt like I didn't get enough. We just didn't get into stuff as in depthly as I wanted. But then I read it and I transcribed it and I sat with it for a while, and I said, but this is the most information about his music that I've ever read. And I've read every John Carpenter book there is. So I had to kind of take the consolation prize, which is I didn't get what I wanted, but there's no interview up to that point that is better about his, at least as informative about his music as this one. So,
and what was the second interview like? You said they were like night and day.
Oh yeah. So by the second time I interviewed him, he talked about his music on everything.
Right.
And I swear to God, he was playing a video game while we were talking. He was just over it. He did it, and he was cordial and he was nice. But he could tell now he had stock answers for things because they were the same answers that he had said. I mean, I talked to him mostly about the album that had come out or was coming. Yeah, I guess by that point it was out or was just about to come out. And I did ask him a few questions about some things that I wish I had asked him about the first time, like In the Mouth of Madness. And so a couple of follow-up questions on other things, but he was over it by that point. He was tired of talking about it. He had done so many in such a short amount of time. And even his assistant was like, I don't know, he's kind of over it now.
What's your favorite Carpenter then? What's your, if that's not too sort of asinine a thing to ask?
Score or film?
Film.
Well, in a lot of ways, they're my children, man. So I don't know.
The house is on fire, and you can only take one.
I do tend to steer. I have always kind of, as much as I love Escape from New York and Big Trouble in Little China, They Live and stuff, I've always been even more passionate about his horror movies. The Thing. I mean, it's really a masterpiece. You know, it's funny because when I was getting into horror movies, my dad, who considers himself an intellectual, especially when it comes to things like cinema, and he is to a certain extent. He's a lawyer and he's well read and he's read every classic novel there is. But it was so funny that he was so down on horror movies when I got into it, because so many of the horror movies that I loved were movies that I saw with him. He had this thing called the VCR in the early 80s, and my parents were divorced, and so when I'd visit him on weekends, we would rent movies, and I didn't have that at my mom's house, and I didn't know anybody else that had that at that point. And so I remember seeing The Thing with him as a kid, Christine with him as a kid, because that was Poltergeist, even though I was like 6, it was the 80s, so you didn't, there wasn't, oh, you're too young to see this kind of stuff.
And you've got The Thing is, of course, being scored by Ennio Morricone, and I was always curious about how that came about and how that happened. And of course, in the book, you addressed that. I was really pleased to sort of find out that Morricone essentially, Carpenter sort of said, "Could you do it a little bit like me?" And Morricone just basically did one of the best John Carpenter scores I've ever heard. I mean, not as in a score for a John Carpenter film, but score by John Carpenter.
Well, if there is, I feel like genre films, for the most part, are the place where you can really point to the auteur theory. Yes, of course, you can talk about Scorsese, but in a lot of ways, the films that you're talking about when you talk about a Scorsese film are genre films. They're not horror. It's not a horror genre. But, so when you start talking about the auteur theory, when you talk about directors who have a very specific personal stamp on their movies, when you see their movies, it's them. They're dealing with similar subject matter, the way they look, everything. Guillermo del Toro is a perfect example, even though Nightmare Alley is not dealing with fantasy. It's actually like the anti-fantasy film in terms of content and subject matter. When you watch it, it's him. John Carpenter is kind of the king of that, and he made it clear with the deal he got with Halloween. I'll do it for X amount of dollars, blah, blah, blah. And it will say John Carpenter's Halloween at the top of the movie. And I think almost every movie, if not every movie after that, it's John Carpenter's The Thing, John Carpenter's The Fog. And part of that, and I asked him, because I said, look, you've always said, when people have asked, why did you do the music? You always said, well, I was the cheapest and the quickest. And I said, but by the time you get to, The Fog, Escape from New York, look, Sean Cunningham was not working with a lot of money and managed to hire Harry Manfredini to do what's now a pretty iconic symphonic score. So, you could afford, I could understand with maybe Halloween and Assault on Precinct 13, but once you've had a couple of hits, once you've had a hit with Halloween, you can afford to hire somebody. And he was almost irritated by the question. He's like, okay, I get where you're coming from. And he admitted that it was just another way of him to have control over the film, another way for him to put his stamp on the movie. And so it's kind of,
you call him out on his bullshit there. Really. I mean, because it is kind of bullshit, because the proof is the scores that he writes are brilliant. And if they weren't brilliant, then okay, I was cheap and I was there and I was easy, I was quick. Fair enough. If they were sort of patched together and amateurish, but the fact that again and again, it's not just like he fluked with Halloween. They're all good, I mean, I don't know them as well as you do, but Escape from New York, The Fog, Assault on Precinct 13, Halloween, all fantastic.
Christine's great. All of his scores are great. I mean, absolutely. And so part of my intent that when I went into the books, there was a couple of things. Like, it was, I want to do the definitive interviews with these guys. So in a lot of ways, it was like, okay, what are the stock answers when Harry Manfredini talks about the and Halloween? He gives a reason. It was because of, at the end of the movie, Friday the 13th. He has his answer. So I was like, okay, I feel like I need to include that question. When you go to a concert, even if you're the biggest of Billy Joel fans and you don't really care about it, you want to hear the deep cuts. You also want to hear you want to hear Piano Man at the end. You want to hear the greatest hits in addition to some of the deeper cuts. So that was kind of the way I approached it. It was like, okay, I need to get the greatest hits, but I said to myself, but maybe I can get them to go deeper into it than nobody's ever said. So I definitely had, part of my mission was, yes, there's stock answers, but what's deeper than that? So when I asked Carpenter about that question, it was like, okay, I get that, it makes sense, but other people are hiring people with less money. So it's not really surprising when it comes to, he hires Ennio Morricone, who, if there was a Mount Rushmore of film music composers, Ennio Morricone would be on it. I mean, some of the greatest scores of all time, one of the most celebrated composers in cinema, that when he gets the score, he says, yeah, thanks, but can you make it sound like me?
Yeah. A few more. I love the thing he says about, can I have some less notes?
Yeah, fewer notes.
Yeah, it's like the emperor in Amadeus telling Mozart, the human ear can only hear so many notes. But he does. Ennio Morricone seems to understand immediately okay, you want this, and I can do that. But not only can I do it and it not be a pastiche, I'll do it and it will be one of the best scores you've never written.
Yeah, and it's also, he talks about the way they did it, which was, basically Ennio Morricone sent him cues and then he worked them into the movie, which was a very Italian thing. That's the way throughout the 70s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, all the guys from Goblin, Fabio, Frizzi, that's the way they did it. They saw the movie, or they read the score, or they read the script. They saw a cut of the movie, but then they went and they recorded music, and then the filmmakers or the editors just cut it in however they wanted it to be cut in. So that's it's also a way of scoring that I'm sure Ennio Morricone was totally comfortable and familiar with, even though he hadn't been doing it. He probably, actually 82, he was probably still doing it for a lot of Italian movies by then.
I just interviewed Giuseppe Torratore, who's just made a very big documentary on Ennio Morricone, and one of the things he said in terms of skill is he doesn't have, obviously he's writing music, he doesn't have digital technology, he doesn't have a deck that he can just use and just time things and fix things in post. He has to write something which is 43 seconds long, and that's it. And once you've got that, there's not much you can do with it. You're just using that. So it's very, very precise and very, very, so it's just really interesting that's the way Goblin are doing it as well. And
yeah, there's stuff about process that I never would have imagined. Talking to I think Jay Chattaway, who was probably best known for the horror fans as the composer for the movie Maniac, the 1980 version, not the remake, which I interviewed the composer of the remake for the second book, Rob. Yeah, but Maniac was such an iconic score for me. Dave introduced me to that score when we were in college, and I just loved that score. So when I started doing it, and when I started writing the book, I was like, I need to talk to Jay Chattaway. Jay Chattaway is probably best known to most people for writing music for like Star Trek: The Next Generation and all the iterations of the Voyager, those kinds of Star Trek shows. But for crazy people like me, I know him for Maniac and Silver Bullet, which are two of my favorite horror films. But he talks about it more in depth, but it gets mentioned a lot in both the first book and the second book, that there was this book called, I think they called the Newson book, which was a book that composers used that translated beats per second into frame rates, so that they could figure out, because a lot of them were not scoring directly to picture because it was low budget. What we were just talking about with Ennio Morricone and the Italian style, a lot of the lower budget horror movies, the technology didn't exist to make that easy. So it's okay. They would watch the movie and 3 seconds into the score, I need a big punch, a big hit, suspense, ambience. And so composers had these books where they'd be like, okay, so the piece of music, we're going at X amount of beats per second, film runs at 24 frames a second, so how many seconds do I there was a lot of math involved, which I never would have I mean, it's kind of genius when you learn about it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And wow, what an interesting thing. But, I didn't know anything about that until they started talking about it. But then so many of them, that's how they had to work, to kind of calculating, because they weren't looking at the picture, but using formulas, algorithms for music to film.
And to go to the sort of second sort of group of heroes, I guess, the Goblin guys, who you are, you just, for our listeners, you're wearing a Goblin t-shirt as we speak. So in case there was any doubt of your closeness to this music, I mean, I love the Goblin stuff. I love the Dario Argento, Jali, and Suspiria. In fact, I was reading your book on the train, and I immediately sort of put Suspiria on my phone to play it while I was reading. I mean, it must have been great talking to those guys.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a language barrier, and I would have loved to interview more of them. And I tried, I made an attempt. I reached out to them, and Maurizio Guarini is in the book, but Massimo Morante, who's the guitar player of the original lineup of Goblin, and Fabio Pignatelli, who's the bass player. I really wanted to interview them too, and they were kind of game, but it was going to be one of those things where I had to send them questions, and I actually did that with Fabio Frizzi for the book, and I did that with the Japanese composers who are in the second book because of the language barrier. And it ultimately just didn't work out. I think I sent them questions and I never heard back. And I would have loved to talk more to them about. I would have loved to have talked to them, because I think, at least in America, when I was getting into them, and for decades, I don't know what it's like now. The internet kind of changed everything, and social media, especially in terms of, what we all know and the movies we know. I joke around that, like, now, Inferno is on, television, Dario Argento's Inferno, but back in, when I got into them, you'd be lucky if you found a copy of it anywhere. But there was this conception that, excuse me, there was this thought that I felt everybody just assumed Claudio Simonetti was Goblin, because Goblin is what people attached themselves to with Goblin is the synthesizers, and he was the keyboard player. And so I think he's the lead, he's the head of Goblin, he's the leader, he was the main composer. And it's not true. I mean, he was a member of a band and they wrote those scores together. I think in a lot of ways, Fabio Pignatelli is kind of the lost, he's the hero. He's the real hero of that band, because after Massimo Morante left, after Claudio Simonetti left, he kept it going, and he did some of the great scores in the 80s that we know them, that have now become more popular since they started touring, and the kind of this resurgence of horror film music has happened while I was working on the book, and especially after. So I think it's clear that Fabio Pignatelli had a very strong creative hand in all of this. And, so I wanted to talk to them, because I felt like there was so much more about what we all think about the music than there's so much more to it than I think we all think about it. But of course, Claudio was great. I was a fan of Demonia. He continued to work with Argento after he left Goblin. So there was a lot to talk to him about, both with Goblin and outside of Goblin. Maurizio Guarini was interesting because he now lives in Canada, and so he's a little more comfortable with English. And he was touring with them when I saw them. He's also a keyboard player, and he worked as a session musician on a lot of horror movie scores that weren't even Goblin. And you come to find out.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head to head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Later with the book Seven Notes in Red, and you come to realize that, and even some of it's talked in my book with Fabio Frizzi, that with my interview with Fabio Frizzi, that they all worked as session musicians on tons of scores. It was part of their deal with their record label, who was a film music record label. So that, they work on the Fabio Frizzi stuff for Lucio Fulci. They work on horror films. They work on non-horror films. And it was interesting to get into a lot of that, but I didn't know a lot of it. So I wish I could have dive more into it. But yeah, I mean, it was fascinating. Italian horror music is a different breed. It's a different style of filmmaking. The way they approach it, the sensibilities are different, and the way they made the music, the equipment they used, everything is kind of different, and it shaped film music in a lot of ways. I mean, in a way, I think more people know Goblin now, but my mom wouldn't maybe know Goblin because she's heard me say it. But for the most part, it's a generational thing now.
Sorry about that. I forgot to turn my phone off. I'll cut that. I'll edit that out, or I'll keep it in. Maybe it'll be. Maybe he's in the house. He's calling from inside the house.
But they inspired Carpenter. Carpenter has said that he saw Suspiria, and that's one of his favorite movies, one of his favorite scores. So yeah, I mean, up to that point. Now, like I said, there's this book that's released in English called Seven Notes in Red. But at that point, there really wasn't anything available in America. And Maurizio Guarini was interesting because he was kind of an on-again, off-again member. And he even says, he was never, at that time, through the 70s, when he worked with them in the 70s and then again in the 80s, he was not even an official member of the band. He never signed a contract to be a member of Goblin. He wanted to stay separate, even though he worked with them. I think he's even uncredited on Boyo Omega and Patrick and some of the late 70s, early 80s stuff after Claudio Simonetti leaves. It's a very rich and complicated history that now had more light shed upon it, but at the time there really wasn't. So I took great pride in being someone to bring at least some information about those guys to horror movie fans who just, like I said, there was a lot of legend stuff, urban legend. People had assumptions. You hear things. Got to ask Claudio about. There was always this. Oh, they wrote all this music for Suspiria that Argento used on set. And that he would blare the music on set to frighten the actors into submission. And so I asked Claudio about that, and he said, yeah, we did write a bunch of stuff based on the script, but when the movie was cut together, we realized that none of that music worked for the movie. So they went and then re-recorded what is now probably their most famous score, Suspiria. So yeah, it was. Look, I mean, for a guy who, like I said, I was completely obsessed with them off and on. When I saw them in 2013, even probably leading up to that, because they had released a live album from Live in Rome a year or two before that, which I ordered not a bootleg, but I ordered an imported, vinyl and CD from Italy, which cost a fortune at that, and let's put it this way, from 2013 through 2016, obviously because I was working on the books, I didn't listen to anything but horror film music because I was researching. But even when I listened to music in my spare time that wasn't research, I listened to Goblin. So for 3 years straight, if I wasn't listening to something for research, I just was listening to Goblin. And during that time, they put out an album, or shortly after that, called Four of a Kind, because they reunited and toured again without Claudio Simonetti. It's just look, it's band dynamics. They love each other, but they can't work with each other. Even Claudio in the interview equates it to being it was a marriage. And when they came back to do Sleepless, Non Ho Sono for Dario Argento in 2000, he said all the same things came up. He was like, he recreates it to being, it's like you get divorced, then you try to get back with your wife, with your ex-wife, and still all the issues are still there.
Sure. And Dario Argento has a new film being shown right now in the Berlin Film Festival. I've not seen any reviews, but I believe it's already been bought. I believe somebody's already picked it up. I've got a feeling I might be talking out of my hat now, but I've got a feeling maybe should have bought it straight away. But
yeah. I know of it, and I finally watched the trailer a day or two ago. I just kind of stopped watching trailers because I just want to go on fresh to things.
Fair enough.
But I said, yeah, what the heck?
I want to ask a couple of sort of general questions about your relationship to horror music as well, and sort of. So one question was, I'd like to know: is there a score that you really love, which isn't the film doesn't quite live up to, that you think, oh, I love the music to the film, and the film's okay, but not.
I think the first one that popped into my head was The Dark Half, which was a George Romero movie, because I just love Christopher Young's score for that. Chris is just so talented. He's probably best known for doing Hellraiser and Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. But he's worked in all genres. He works sometimes with Sam Raimi. He did Spider-Man 3. I love his score for Drag Me to Hell, which is probably one of my favorite scores he ever did. He's such a brilliant orchestral composer, and he loves doing the synth stuff, and he kind of wants to do more of that kind of stuff. But The Dark Half, and in talking to Chris, I learned that there was just a lot of issues with that movie. Romero wasn't well for some of it, and he departed the project, before post-production, and there was stuff that wasn't finished. So I don't, and I do like the movie. There are things about it that I like a lot, but I think when you watch it and after you hear about the kind of problems that it had, you can kind of see that this could have been so much better than it ended up being, even though, like I said, I'm not knocking George Romero or the film. Just sometimes films just don't live up to their potential, and I think that's one of them. And I think there were reasons that are outside of Romero's control for that. And even Chris talks about he doesn't really love the score because he doesn't feel like he ever got to finish it, because the movie was never really finished. And so he never really got to do everything he wanted to do with it. But what he does for that, the stuff he did do for that movie, I think is gorgeous. And I always kind of say, in a lot of ways, I think Chris was the Danny Elfman before Danny Elfman, because a lot of the stuff that we equate with Danny Elfman's sound, the chorus, stuff like that, is stuff that Chris had been doing since Hellraiser and before. And his stuff for Dark Half, I would think some people would think is very Elfman-esque, but it's also at the same time so quintessentially Chris Young. And I just think it's a gorgeous score, and I think that film unfortunately just doesn't live up to how gorgeous that music really is.
Brilliant. That's one I can put on my to be listened to list. Another question I wanted to ask is, you were talking earlier on about the sort of a golden age of horror, sort of late 80s, early 90s, when you could get these video cassettes of these films and watch them. But in recent years, there's been an absolute renaissance in horror. There's been, we've had J-horror and loads of stuff coming out of different cultures and different countries. And then we've had this sort of Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, to some degree Eggers, I would put in that thing. But an absolute explosion of really interesting horror. Do you think that those new horror films are sort of approaching music differently as well?
That's an interesting question that I never really thought about. I think musical styles change, and I think that is also clear with film music. I think a lot of horror film music in the last 20 years, and this is a general statement, and obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but I think generally speaking, especially even in the last 10 years, is less melodic and more about atmosphere. And I think that stretches to even non-horror films, but I think it's really clear in horror films too. Joseph Bishara, who is in the first, who I interviewed for the first book, and he's done the Conjuring movies and the Insidious movies, and there are melodic score pieces in a lot of that stuff, but the stuff that works best in his scores is just like this wall of sound that is just bone chilling, blood curdling. I've told him that when I saw Insidious, there were cues that when they hit, they were so on the money that they made me laugh. And I said, and that's not because that was funny or they didn't work. I'm someone that, when I go to see a band and a guitar player just shreds, and it's just like he hits everything and it's just so perfect. Like joy comes out of me and laughter. When I used to go see Tom Petty, and when Mike Campbell would take a solo on like American Girl, and he'd start doing the chicken picking stuff, and it was just like, it was so good that I just couldn't contain myself. And that's the way I found myself laughing at cues in the Insidious, because they were so perfect. But a lot of his stuff is just very atmospheric, and you see a lot of that stuff in the Ari Aster films. I feel like that's obviously atmosphere has always been a big thing in horror. And I think just the way people approach it is different now. I mean, clearly the way John Carpenter does atmosphere is very different than the way, Joseph Bishara does, who just assaults you with, it's actually very, akin to some of the Suspiria stuff. When you get past the theme and you start to hear the cues like witches, and they just bombard you with wailing vocals and sound. So it's not like it's new. I just feel like that kind of stuff gets used more. And the technology changes things. They all talk about how now they have to mock up things, which is basically what they do for directors, is they do the entire score in the computer, even if it's an orchestral score, because the directors are just used to hearing it the way, so they actually have to like kind of complete the score ahead of time in a way that could be used in the movie, and then go and record it again with an orchestra when they're doing an orchestral score. Budgets I think are less, time is probably less for the most part. So I think a lot of that, I think also, it comes across in the style. They just have less time and less money to work with.
I was listening to Hans Zimmer's score for Dune recently, and that you'd be hard put to find a melody in that. It's just a kind of persistent ambient drone. I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily. No. But that's what it is. It's just like if you go, how there's YouTube videos of ambient soundscapes, and I found the one for Dune, and it's just the soundtrack. It's absolutely no different from the soundtrack, because
that's just, I think when I talk to some of the older composers or more seasoned, more experienced composers about these kinds of things, they always kind of say, like, the way they did it in the 70s and 80s, those more melodic scores are thought of as being old-fashioned. And there's so much homage and what's the word I'm looking for? Nostalgia in film, that we do get some of that kind of, we just do, Stranger Things is a perfect example, so we do get some of that kind of what is now considered old fashioned scoring, but it's usually in a way of harkening back to things that we're nostalgic for. People ask me these kinds of questions all the time. They ask me about, like the Marvel movies and what I think about those scores. And they say, like, I can't remember what they sound like or whatever, but so, well, it's hard to say because I'm not, 8 when I'm seeing these movies, like I was when I saw Star Wars and, Indiana Jones, and, maybe kids that are seeing them now, those are going to be the scores that they love as adults. We're not seeing them now. Jay Chattaway talks a lot about, and it's something that comes up a lot, but he, I think, puts it best in the first book, where he talks about, we talk a lot about temporary scores. And that something was kind of always done, but is really always done now, which is the editor uses pre-existing cues in the editing for rhythm, because they're going to show it to potential investors and they can't show it without music. And then the composer is given a cut of the movie and it has this temporary score on it. Sometimes it's cues they've written, sometimes it's not, often it's not. And they're kind of asked to do that. Get as close to that as sometimes as close to that. They talk about temp love, which is when they cannot write something that satisfies the filmmakers, the producer, and the director enough as the piece of music that's already in there. Now, what Jay Chattaway talks about in his interview, is that now, because it's a practice that everybody uses, everybody's temping with the same music. So when everybody's temping with the same music, the scores all start to sound the same because they're all striving for the same thing. I think there's some truth to that. I don't know how extreme it is, probably not in practice as extreme as some of them kind of attribute it to, I think, but it makes sense. And but when you get there's Marvel movies coming out every year, it's a cinematic universe, and I would imagine that there is some talk about continuity in sound. So we do get a lot of stuff that kind of sounds the same. And because melodic scores are not quite as popular nowadays as they used to be, they might not be as memorable as they are in the long run. For my podcast, I talked to Bill Conti, who's one of my favorite composers of all time. Rocky is my favorite movie, and he did the Rocky score. He did all the Rocky scores except for number 4, which I also love that score by Vince DiCola. Just, it's a very different beast. He did Karate Kid, which is also a movie and a score that I love. And so he's not known for horror movies, but after I did 2 books on it, I was like, well, I'm not just interested in horror movie music. But he also did do a score for a horror film called Nomads that I love that movie. It's Pierce Brosnan's first movie, and it was John McTiernan's first feature film, and it's a really interesting film. So he did do a horror movie. We do talk about that, but I talked to him about, because his scores are obviously so melodic, and he's coming from the 70s and into the 80s. I think he won the Academy Award for The Right Stuff, and but also he had a unique position in that for many years he was the conductor of the orchestra at the Academy Awards. And when you watch the Academy Awards, you hear some of the great film scores of all time, but specifically the film scores, the most popular themes of that year. So I said, you've in this unique position where you've conducted for a decade more the popular films. And so I said, do you find that things have changed over the years, the way music is written? And he's the one that said, look, there's trends like anything else. And he's the one that kind of pointed out that just the things are just not as melodic. And that's something that obviously I think you can hear yourself, and I talked to with some of the other guys in the books. But it's just things are different now. Horror isn't different either in terms of, film music fills a lot of jobs in cinema, and some of them are unique. And in horror, some of the things that it does are unique to horror. But ultimately, that was one of the things that really became clear to me when I was interviewing these guys, is like music does so many things within a movie. Because even as a fan of horror, of film music in general, and you listen to it and you appreciate it, you don't really, as a fan normally, unless you're a certain type of person, and I wasn't, really analyze how it's working and what it's doing. There are things where they call back to earlier things in the movie that, it's almost like a flashback, but when you hear a certain melody of a character that died, earlier in the movie, it's like the emotional element of the movie. And so it does everything from calling back to earlier things, and obviously atmosphere. The jump scares are a big thing in horror. There's just so many things that it does. And so in a lot of ways, that kind of stuff doesn't change, because there are certain jobs that it has, but how it approaches those jobs, how it does those jobs, sometimes does change. And this is a really long-winded answer for for a very simple question.
It's all right. When I edit it, it'll just be like you going, "Yep, you're right, John." I'm joking.
But also, you brought up, Asian horror as being something that's, more of a, now it's been 20 years, but more of a contemporary style of horror. And I was lucky enough in the second book to interview 2 Japanese composers, Kenji Kawai and Koji Endo, because like I said earlier with the second book, part of my mission was like, what can I do with the second book that I didn't do with the first one? And I was mostly American composers, but there was some Italian composers in the first books. What's the other really important version of horror, culturally, regionally, that I should talk to? And obviously Asian horror came to mind at the time. And so I reached out. It was very hard getting those interviews, and conducting those interviews were very difficult because of the language barrier. And so those interviews feel very different in the book. They're a lot shorter. But again, I take pride in the fact that I have maybe the only 2 interviews with those guys in English that you'll be able to find. But also what became clear in those interviews, even though they were short and I couldn't talk to them the way I did most of the other composers, there's a cultural difference, obviously, in life. And that comes across in the movies and how they approach the music. And so those kinds of things change. So, I mean, it's all stuff. I guess why this is such a long-winded answer is because it's all stuff that as a listener, you can't typically put your finger on, because in the best case scenario in films, one could argue the best scores are the ones you never hear, because they're working in a way that you're so involved in the narrative of the movie that it's so much a part of it that you don't recognize that it's playing. And even if you do, it's taking you on this emotional journey and you're not thinking about it technically or scholarly. You're just accepting it. And the way music works in movies in so many ways, but that emotional level, I think when it's working, you would never know what's different, because ultimately it's all, like I said, they're all trying to fulfill certain goals in their jobs. And some of those jobs are akin to all genres or specific to every genre. But if they're doing it right, who cares how they get there?
Sure. What about, okay, that leads on to my another question, which is there a score that you listening to separately from the film you find really scary, that it has that sort of effect on you, it chills you? What would be sort of the scariest score?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, probably the stuff that is not melodic, the things like Joseph Bishara's stuff and some of the Suspiria stuff. There's a film called Black Christmas, the original one. Carl Zitcher, his last name is spelled very oddly. I never know how to pronounce it. A lot of that is just like banging piano strings and stuff and running things along them. It's not music in any kind of conventional sense. Those kinds of things, because they're so foreign to the way we think about music, that when you get those, it's hard not to have some kind of visceral reaction, even if it's not like because it's reminding you of the movie. A lot of the scores, like Rocky, for instance, like I can literally cry listening to that score, but it's because my emotions to that music are so tied to that movie and that story. The last cues of that score, like I literally could just listen to that album and cry because it's so tied in. We're talking about music, quote unquote music, that doesn't need that emotional response, that connection. It in itself is so viscerally kind of disturbing that it literally like attacks your ears in a way that conventional music kind of doesn't. Chris Young is working on a project right now that I can't talk too much about because hasn't announced or everything, but it's not a film. It's more of a kind of a retrospective thing. And he asked me to listen to a bunch of things for him. And some of it is like that. There's stuff that he wrote for Invaders from Mars that I don't think gets used in the movie. I think they didn't like it. It got rejected. But when he gets more synthy, when Chris Young does more synthesized stuff, things like Sinister, Empty Man is a more recent film that he did. When he works in synth, he gets very kind of out there, and it is very like visceral. And I told him, I said, look, this is not my kind of music. This is like, I would listen to this once because you did it, and it does take me on a journey in its own right, but it's not a journey I want to go on often.
No, I mean, but there are loads of films that do that. There are some of my favorite films I never want to see again, and it's not because some of them it is because they're they take me into too dark places. I don't know, Son of Saul, for instance, or Michael Haneke's Amour, I wouldn't want to see again. Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, I wouldn't want to see again. But even like a film like Blue is the Warmest Color, which is a beautiful film, which I really loved, I had such a great time watching it the first time. It's just why would I watch it again? And I watch loads of films multiple times, but I don't know, some films they're such a great experience. And the same thing with scores, that sometimes, or pieces of music, it's not inevitable that everything has to be repeated endlessly, for you to appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I was thinking of Howard Shore music for Seven. Has you could listen to that outside of the film and it just has a relentless that puts you in the head of a serial killer, and it's not a comfortable place to be, but it's very effective.
I mean, music is it's an interesting art form because it's invisible. You know what I mean? Like we don't experience it the way we do a painting, a sculpture, a movie even. I mean, movies are interesting because it's a collaborative art form that encompasses so many different art forms to make one end product, from set design to cinematography to music to acting. It's like the ultimate art form in a lot of ways because it's the culmination of all these great art forms. But music is, spoken word, I guess, would be one that you experience, just sonically, but there aren't many. And so I feel like you must experience it through on a different part of your brain than you do other things. And you can look at a painting and have an emotional response to it, but I don't feel like it's ever going to be unless it really does sense memory, some experience that you had, and you look at it and it's like it reminds you of your mother who passed away or whatever. Obviously you could have very profound emotional responses to visual art, but music, I think, does it attacks you in a different way emotionally, and it's very mathematical, in a way that I don't understand. It's its own language. These guys, the reason why I was so afraid that I might not be the guy to write these books is because I'm not fluent in the language that these guys are speaking. Ultimately, I found a way in, and most of them teach. So when I didn't understand something, I could say, can you explain that in layman's terms? And we could talk about it and they could explain it in a way that I felt most readers would understand. That was kind of my goal. I discovered maybe I don't talk that language, but they also speak my language. And so, maybe I could find a nice balance where this book can be informative to people who want to score movies and they can get a lot out of it. But people who just love film music or love horror movies can read it and they can understand it and get something out of it too. But music is, it's such, whether it's a pop song and it has vocals or it's a piece of classical music, it is an emotional thing. I think for whether it makes us happy or it irritates the hell out of us because it's, Baby Shark or whatever, or it's something like Howard Shore's score for Seven, which I feel like in a lot of ways was kind of groundbreaking, and that it might be one of those scores that ushered in this kind of scoring that we're talking about that's more relevant today. And like I was saying with the movies, that's kind of what it does for the movies. I mean, they all explain what it does. Because I ask most, if not all of them, what is your job, or what does film music do? And Harry Manfredini. I don't know why he's the one guy that keeps coming up in this conversation when there's 30 guys. But like one of his things was, as a film music composer, you're a dramatist. You're doing everything for the movie that the picture isn't already doing. And, and some of them also, the emotional content is stuff. And we talk about with Tom Hajdu, who is the part of the writing team of Tom and Andy. He talks about like passive music versus active music. And it's just, the long and short of it is like, one of the big revelation to me was how many things it does. But at the end of the day, it's really about emotion. And even though the emotion they're often trying to achieve in horror movies isn't comedy or isn't happiness or romanticism, or it's they're trying to scare you. But at the same time, you get a score like Richard Band's score for House on Sorority Row, which I talk about with Richard in the second book. And that's a score that is just gorgeous. It's this lush orchestra. It's a waltz. Just the way Hellraiser is with Christopher Young, and that main theme, it's just like this very dark waltz. Whereas if you heard Richard Band's score for aside from some of the actual like suspense scenes, but if you heard some of those themes, you would never imagine that those are for a pretty, average isn't the word, but a pretty typical slasher movie of the early 80s. And like that was also a job that I said, what, in listening to his stuff was this revelation of like, one of the things that film music can do is add production value, a gravitas to a movie that isn't there. Look, House of Sorority Row, perfectly fine slasher movie of, during a time of slasher movies. But if you put, the Prowler's score, which is a great score and a great slasher movie score, on House of Sorority Row, it becomes something very different than what Richard does with it. And Richard adds this weight to it, and it makes it feel important in a way that another score just wouldn't do.
That sounds almost like the answer to the question earlier about the dark half as well. It sounds like that's you really appreciate the score, and the film's okay, but the score is that's another kind of perfect example, because I just love that score. But I like the movie, but my love for that score has nothing to do with the movie. It has everything to do with what Richard Band brought to that score. I really love the score for Tron Legacy, and the film's pretty. I watched it once. I have no intention of watching it again, but I've got that score on my playlist. Right. Listen, Blake, I've got to ask you a final question, which is, can you recommend a film book for us? There is no limit, except you're not allowed to recommend your own film book. That's obvious, because this whole podcast is a recommendation for your film book.
Yeah. I kind of thought long and hard. This was the one question you gave me ahead of time. So I thought long and hard about this. Mostly what I read in my spare time for enjoyment are books on film, and also, like biographies on musicians. Like those are the kind of nonfiction stuff is what so there were a lot of books that I could choose here. And I don't even think that maybe the book I'm going to mention is kind of relevant now the way it was when I read it. I talked about how I was a teenager in the mid 90s and how I made a lot of movies with my friends on VHS. And I was kind of the perfect age for that early to mid 90s independent film boom of Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, Kevin Smith, all that kind of stuff. And it was because of those, even though most of those movies aren't necessarily films that I still love today, I do have to attribute that the fact that I got into wanting to make movies, and even this book in a way, because of those movies. So there was a book that I read when I was, 15 or 16. And there has since been an updated version. But it was a book called King of Pulp, The Wild World of Quentin Tarantino. by Paul A. Woods. And I read it just after Pulp Fiction. And like I said, I think there's an updated version that goes through maybe Jackie Brown. And Quentin Tarantino is definitely not a filmmaker that I have continued to be as passionate about as I was when I discovered, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. But what was great about that book is it was, in a lot of ways, a biography. But in most ways, it was a biography through the movies that he liked and influenced him. And for a kid in the mid-90s, without the internet, before Google and all this stuff that you now, I guess I say, I don't know if it's relevant now because people know things and it's easy to find this information. But it was flipping through the pages of that book and reading that book that, it was like, he talked about Lucio Fulci, and it was like, what is this crazy movie he's talking about where a zombie wrestles a shark underwater? And he talks about Dario Argento, and he talks about Sonny Chiba. So all these things that I still love today, I kind of discovered through reading that book. And I remember being in New York City when I was in film school and being in a video store and seeing Zombie at a video store. I'm like, oh, that's the movie from that Quentin Tarantino book with the zombie wrestles a shark. And I bought it. And so and then instantly fell in love with that score. So for me, it was a very important book. I don't know if people today will take away from it the kinds of things that I took away from it, 20 plus years ago. But to me, it was kind of quintessential, and it probably maybe impacted me and influenced me more profoundly than most film books because of when I read it and what access I had to things. It was kind of, in a way, a Bible to what would later be the films that I do really love.
Yeah, I mean, that's I've got the same sort of film education where I was picking up books about. I remember there being a book I got from Barrow in Furness Library called Midnight Movie Madness or something like that. It was just like a, alphabetically organized with little blurbs of what they considered sort of midnight cult movies. And so many movies were totally unavailable. You just couldn't find them anywhere. But even today, I will come across a film and think, "Oh, I read about this in midnight." When I was 13 years old, I read about this. I want to see this. And that's, I think those are great things, and I hope people still have some experience of that, because it's like, I mean, the clickbaity article that says, the top 10 such and such movies ranked best to worst or whatever. It just doesn't quite get my juices flowing in the same way.
Yeah, well, and I talk about this in the introductions to both books, like kind of the way the internet and everything changed the way we learn about things. And as great as it all is, it united us virtually as fans that we never had before. And you learn through that. And then you have all these, starting with Anchor Bay in the late 90s onto Blue Underground with Bill Lustig, who worked at Anchor Bay. And then now Shout Factory and Scream Factory and Severin and all these great things that are making things available. But there was a beauty to the hunt that people these days will never really know. There was like reading about a movie in a book, and then 5 years later, be like, holy cow, this is that movie. This is that one. And and stumbling upon it in a seedy movie store in Manhattan, it's a very different thing. And a lot of the scores, when I got in Italian movies, a lot of those scores were a hunt. It was finding them in weird record stores, going to horror conventions, going on message before Facebook and all that, going on message boards and saying like, hey, does anybody have this? And then like literally sending them a blank cassette so that they could tape it for you. And then later CDRs, sending things to Italy so that they would send stuff back to
me. We've got to stop this, because at some point we're going to start going, the kids today, they don't know the Listen, Blake, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. I think your books will They got me. I was flipping through my Spotify. I know I shouldn't use Spotify anymore, but anyway, I was a music service. I was flipping through and I was putting in names and listening to stuff as I was reading the book. So it was getting me into a new education. I knew some of it, but certainly nothing like the breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge that you have. So thanks so much, Blake.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about this kind of stuff with people and share my work with people that maybe don't know about it, because ultimately the books are not, I think of the books as they're mine, but they're ours. They're me and the composer's books, and they're not about me. They're about them, and they are people. And one of the main goals for them was to bring awareness and kind of celebrate these people. And so to be able to promote them to people that might not know it, might not follow me on Twitter or whatever, might not even be horror movie fans, but know that the books are not just about horror. It's really about sending the message that these kinds of people, and specifically these people, but film music in general is such a wonderful thing. And though more recognized today than maybe ever before, still not as recognized as maybe it should be. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of spread the word and celebrate these composers with you and your audience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Blake. By the way, where could listeners follow you on Twitter? What's your handle?
Well, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, I'm at Scored to Death. And the books are available on Amazon as in ebook and paperback, other book retailers as well. Or if people are interested in getting a signed copy, especially if you're in the US, because shipping is a big pain in the butt cost-wise, you can order books directly from me at scoredtodeath.com.
So that was my conversation with Blake. I hope you enjoyed it. It certainly got me going through my playlist and listening to some Goblin and some other composers. Thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and thank you all for listening. See you next week.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.